Oh, the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way.
Oh, the Jesus way
Is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me. Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Christ is king in my life now. May his peace begin with me.
Welcome to Brethren Voices. This morning, we're visiting with Nancy Sollenberger Heishman, who's the moderator of the Church of the Brethren this year, and we're delighted to be able to spend a few minutes with you. Nancy, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you.
Nancy is the 7th or 8th female moderator of the Church of the Brethren, and she has a connection to the first female moderator that was elected in 1989. Nancy, what's your connection with that first moderator?
The first female moderator was Elaine Sollenberger, and she's my aunt. So I remember well when she was called to be moderator, and it was a real joy to see her serve in that role, and it's a privilege for me to be able to serve in the same role as well.
That was really a history-making event to be elected.
It was, and what was interesting afterwards was that Bill Hayes was called to be moderator serving the year following her, and he was the first African-American moderator to serve in the denomination. So I remember I think when she passed the gavel to him, she said something about that we are kind of an odd couple or an odd pair. But what a wonderful sign for the health and life of the denomination. I think most people felt that way.
Can you explain what the moderator does?
Okay. The moderator serves as the spiritual head of the denomination and moderates. The most obvious thing that people see the moderator do is to serve moderating the annual conference of the denomination. That's the annual meeting for each year. But the moderator serves in other roles as well. One of the other very visible roles is to go around and travel, visiting the districts and the local churches, trying to be an encouragement and a strengthening presence to those churches and districts, representing the denomination at their district conferences, and just trying to continue to encourage the denomination and sharing somewhat about the theme and the plans for the annual conference that's coming up. And then the annual conference moderator also serves on the Mission and Ministry Board as an ex officio member, meets with the Interagency Forum, which is the heads of the different agencies, and represents the denomination at some ecumenical meetings as well.
Were you surprised when you were nominated to be moderator?
Yes, I really was. I didn't expect that at all. It was a complete surprise. We had been out of the country for about 8 years, and I had never served on the Mission and Ministry Board or in any of those capacities, so I didn't expect to be called in that role at all. So it was quite a surprise.
And you were one of 4. So,
Yes.
So you really were not too worried about it. You're thinking,
No,
well,
I
there's
didn't
not a
worry
big
much
chance.
in the beginning, which was pretty foolish as I look back now. But I think most people say, well, if I get to the end of the process, well, fine. But I didn't really expect that I would. So, yeah, I'll know next time in other experiences to be a little bit more wary. But I'm happy to serve in that role, and it's a privilege and an honor to be able to.
Do you have a Brethren background? Are you?
Yes, I grew up in the Church of the Brethren. I grew up in the Anvil congregation, which is part of Atlantic Northeast District. Yeah, I grew up on a dairy farm with a family that had been part of the Church of the Brethren for a long time. And so it was a wonderful congregation. I just was there preaching this past weekend, yesterday. It's really wonderful to be back and see that congregation still continuing on strong and faithful and full of faithful servants. It was a wonderful place to grow up.
At what point did you decide you wanted to be in the ministry?
Well, that's an interesting story. My home congregation was rather conservative. They had the free ministry while I was growing up until I was about 9 or 10, and they then called their first salaried pastor.
So when you decided to be a minister and go into the ministry, did you then go to a college?
I did. I was actually living in Cincinnati at that time, and I was I had gone there for graduate school and then stayed an extra year in Cincinnati. I was teaching piano lessons, and I was actually part of a Mennonite congregation and also a non-denominational congregation. It was a time of searching, and so I was worshiping with a number of different congregations, but I really felt a call to get back into the life of the Church of the Brethren. At that point, there was not a Brethren congregation in Cincinnati. There is now, but there wasn't at that time. And I think my sense of call came out of a desire to find a way to use the gifts and talents that I had to serve God more fully, and really felt a longing to serve God and use those gifts in the life of the Church of the Brethren. So I was really praying and searching for where God could use my gifts and talents. And one of the most influential persons at that time was, I had an opportunity to hear Jim Wallace speak. Was very involved in the Sojourners community, and he spoke at a Catholic church in downtown in Cincinnati, and it was a very much of a turning point in my life in terms of putting together that call for a commitment to radical discipleship that I think at its heart is the heart of the Sojourners ministry. They've become involved in a number of political advocacy efforts as well, but that community was really rooted in a commitment to radical discipleship and commitment to following Christ. And he talked especially about the importance of being committed to radically serving the poor and the oppressed and those in poverty. And that seemed to put together a number of emphases that I had that had been part of shaping my life, a radical commitment to following Jesus as a disciple, as well as serving and caring for others, especially those who are needy and downtrodden and oppressed. And so out of that, I just continued to pray and search, and I felt a longing at the same time to be at a place where I could really intensively study the Scriptures. I've had a love of the Scriptures since I was a little girl, and so I found myself drawn either to going into Brethren volunteer service or to going to seminary to study. And it was kind of interesting. I can still remember I went to Elgin I think it was for an interview with Brethren volunteer service, but I also was able to sit down and talk with Grady Snyder, who was a professor at seminary, and he listened very attentively and carefully to what it was that I was searching for and struggling with, and then he said, wherever you go or wherever you sense your call, don't do whatever you do out of obligation. And I think he was trying to say to me, go where you really feel the Spirit calling you and leading and guiding you. And that just somehow or another freed me to be able to affirm what I really was longing to do, which was to go to seminary and study the Scriptures. And so it was really a wonderful moment of being able to accept that sense of call that I had to pursue the Scriptures.
And you were in a graduate school already for something else.
Yeah, I had finished a graduate program at the University of Cincinnati, the College Conservatory of Music. I was a piano performance major. That was in my former life.
I know, but that's so
anymore,
interesting.
Yeah, I don't play as much as I have in the past. I miss having the time to do that, but that's what my life was centered around.
Was your family musical?
Oh, yeah. My mother was a music teacher for years. That was her career, a high school music teacher. Yeah. Yeah, and my whole family was musical as well. I have 2 brothers and a sister, and we all grew up taking lessons. That was obligatory. It wasn't a choice. So
everybody was going to play an instrument.
We were going to play an instrument, whether or not she was a wonderful influence in my life, and especially in the area of music. So.
And you decided to go to seminary where?
I went to Bethany Seminary, Bethany Theological Seminary, which at that time was in Oak Brook, Illinois.
And how long is that seminary program?
It's a 3-year program.
Okay.
And the second year, after my first year of study there, Gene Roop, who was a wonderful influence as well, the Old Testament professor, encouraged me to try a summer pastorate. I had not really, in my first year, thought about being actually involved in pastoral ministry. I was taking a general assortment of classes and enjoying my studies in the biblical studies. But he encouraged me to try a summer pastorate, and I think very wisely encouraged me to go to Mexico, Indiana. And that's where I was able to work with Don Ritchie, and he had been a pastor there for many, many years and was a also a wonderful influence. Very pastoral, kind, warm, loving, caring, wise pastor, and it was just a perfect place. That congregation was also very welcoming. I don't think they'd ever had a woman pastor or seminary student there before, but Don and Mary's daughters are both pastors, so maybe they had a little bit of more openness to that. But it was a wonderful place to serve, and a good place to help discern whether pastoral ministry was really what I was called to or not.
From getting into seminary because you wanted to study the scriptures to getting an experience as a pastor, it's very different. One's kind of meditative and introspective, and the other one's very other people directed, it seems. So did that pastoral experience change your direction?
Well, it did. Yeah, I had a nice balance in that summer of both preaching on a regular basis and also doing a lot of visiting and interaction with the congregation, which was a good experience. I'm basically quite an introvert, so it was a stretch to be involved in such a public ministry and in a ministry where I was interacting with people all the time. So it was a good experience to help me see whether that was something I could feel comfortable with, and also an opportunity to test out those kinds of gifts. And I found that I really enjoyed that interaction between studying the scriptures and searching out for how those scriptures are speaking to the lives of the people I was interacting with. And that's what the preaching task is, to hold the scriptures in one hand and the life and the life of the community in the other hand, and see where God's Spirit speaks back and forth between them.
And after seminary, did you decide to go into pastoral ministry?
I did. My home congregation, graciously enough, being a bit of a conservative congregation, was wonderful in terms of encouraging me to be licensed or ordained, and they were very supportive. There was a pastor at my home congregation at that time, Jim Tyler, who was also very influential in my life and in terms of being an advocate for me and confirming the sense of call that I have. And so they were very supportive at that time. And I did sense a call to go into pastoral ministry, and I was called to the Wilmington, Delaware Church of the Brethren, which is on the southeastern edge of the Atlantic Northeast District.
And somewhere in the middle of this, you met your husband, Irv Heishman. So
I did.
how did he fit into those plans?
Well, we didn't think that he was gonna fit into those plans at the beginning. We were just very good friends and co-students or fellow students at the seminary. But I left seminary then and went to Wilmington, and he had taken an intern year in California at Modesto. And so my first year in Wilmington, he was still out finishing his seminary studies. But it was interesting. There was one moment at which we needed to hire a secretary at Wilmington. Our secretary had left, and I had never gone about that task before of hiring a secretary. So I thought, well, I remembered that when he was in Modesto, they had just an outstanding secretary. And so I gave him a call, and I said, well, I need some advice figuring out how to hire a secretary. What can you tell me? And it just seemed like that conversation kind of rekindled our relationship. And he actually at that time was serving in Hagerstown. So we would meet for the day in Baltimore and enjoy some time together, and then we'd drive back to our respective places, and that relationship developed between Wilmington and Hagerstown as we resumed our friendship. So I was thankful that we needed a secretary at that time.
But he didn't become the secretary?
No. He was serving as a co-pastor in Hagerstown with Guy Wampler.
And then you've actually been able to serve as co-pastors together, and you're currently doing that.
We are. We served as co-pastors our whole married life, which is 25 years this year. So yeah, we've enjoyed doing that. We say that we had good models for that because my parents were dairy farmers working together on the farm, and his parents worked together too for years in the business that they were involved in. So we had good models for how to work mostly harmoniously together. Can't have every day harmonious, but we've had a good relationship working together. We've enjoyed that.
And you have two children,
We do.
a son and a daughter.
Yes, our son Tim is serving in Brethren Volunteer Service in Elgin. He's one of the 3 coordinators of National Youth Conference, and he's having a great time helping to prepare for that conference, which will happen in July. And our daughter Jenny is a junior at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisburg, Virginia. And she's a sustainable agriculture / English major, double major there.
In your travels and in your work as co-pastors, you and your husband were assigned to Dominican Republic, and you were there for seven and a half years. What was that like, and what were you doing in the Dominican Republic?
We served on behalf of the denomination as mission coordinators. And so the word coordinating is a good clue as to what we did. We were responsible for kind of being the bridge or the link between the American church and the Dominican church. And so we supervised staff that were in place in the Dominican Republic, and we also represented the denomination in hosting work groups that would come down for work and projects in the Dominican Republic. And we also just tried to walk alongside the Dominican leadership and give them support as they were developing the church there. Towards the end of the time, I also served as director of the theological education program and worked with theological students there.
Are there a lot of churches, Church of the Brethren, in the Dominican Republic?
There are. I've lost track of how many there are right now, but when we left, there were 21, 22 or so different churches in the Dominican Republic. They're spread out across the country, the central part of the country there.
Tell us about Harrisburg, because that was an inner city church.
It was, yeah. We had a wonderful experience there. We served there for 15 years. And it is a very intense inner city congregation. That congregation is somewhat unique, I think. I don't know how many urban congregations we actually have in the denomination, but many congregations, when they find themselves in an urban setting like that, are tempted to leave. So we move out. And there was a period of time for Harrisburg First when they faced that choice as well. I think it was in the mid to late 50s, and there were some people who really, I think, were more fearful or distressed at the changes in the neighborhood, and felt like the church really ought to move out into the suburbs. And so I think the church showed a lot of wisdom and dedication and perseverance and discernment in that moment to be able to say, we will affirm those who feel a call to leave and affirm those who feel a call to stay. And so the congregation actually gave birth to a new congregation, the Ridgeway congregation, which is out in the suburbs. And then there was a group of people who stayed in that particular urban setting. And I really admire the congregation for having the wisdom and kind of the steadfastness to be able to embrace both of those visions. And so the congregation at Harrisburg First has stayed in that neighborhood for, 1896 is its birth.
Really?
So it's been there over 100 years. And they have a really vibrant life of community ministry that they offer to that neighborhood. And then there are folks from the neighborhood who worship with the congregation. When I was there in September, I just really gave thanks to God for the wonderful diversity that's at work in that congregation. People from different backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and seem to be worshiping together in a really marvelous way. I'm thankful for the leadership of Belita Mitchell too. When we left, it was just such a joy to see that they called Belita to serve that congregation, because that represents an opportunity to relate to the community in ways that we couldn't do, and to move the ministry forward. That was really exciting.
So you were in Harrisburg before going to the Dominican Republic. Did that have anything to do with your decision? Because it's a huge commitment, I think. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how did your family and your husband and you make the decision to take on that kind of a challenge?
Well, it's interesting. The neighborhood around the building of Harrisburg First is a very diverse neighborhood, but one of the people groups in that neighborhood is Hispanic. And so we had learned to know some folks from the Hispanic community, and hadn't learned Spanish at that time, but had sensed that offering a ministry, walking alongside the persons in that neighborhood who spoke Spanish would be something that would be ideal because of the composition of that neighborhood. And I can remember the day when an Hispanic couple walked into the building, Guillermo and Maricel Olivencia, walked into the building and said, we have a little Hispanic group that's meeting in our living room, and we're getting too big for the living room. Could you possibly lend us some space? And that was a really divine moment, because they came, we said, certainly, the building had been lent out to people and shared with people in the neighborhood for years, and they were really quite good at that. And so that Spanish fellowship started meeting in the building, and we started developing a relationship back and forth, and I can remember the moment when Guillermo and Maricel said, well, I think we'd like to be brethren. And we said, oh, okay,
Really?
well, sure, well, that's great. But what does that really mean? And we discovered together that meant that fellowship was going to be part of Harrisburg First congregation. So all of a sudden, Harrisburg First grew by affirming this congregation. And, we had our ups and downs, but overall, the congregation changed dramatically at that moment because they embraced that Hispanic ministry. And that was a wonderful experience, to be able to see how that congregation developed and was shaped and formed by that moment when they walked into the church building. Out of that experience, I guess folks on the denominational level were looking for someone to take over as mission coordinators in the Dominican Republic, and they thought of us, I guess, because they knew that we were relating to folks from the Hispanic community at Harrisburg First. And so they invited us to consider taking that position. And at the first time when they asked us to think about that, we had just started this new bilingual worship service at Harrisburg First. And so we were really struggling with that call. And I remember at that moment we were meeting with the spiritual director and shared that with him. And he said, well, why don't you tell them that it doesn't seem like the right time right now for you, but if something would come up later that you consider that. And so that's what we said, and thought nothing would come of it. But about a year later or so, they came back again and said, we've had an interim serving right in that position, but we think we'd still like to extend the call to you. So at that time, we thought, well, this is maybe something we should really pay attention to and take seriously. And so we made a visit to the Dominican Republic and visited with church leaders and then agreed to the call. Yeah.
Was there a big cultural shift from Dominican Republic to the rural life?
Yeah, we noticed, I think, one of the things we noticed most when we came back into the country after having been away for 8 years was the significant polarization that is part of our society. It's infiltrated into the churches as well, but especially in the society, this separation and polarization between people politically, and it's almost a culture of the political environment on both ends of the spectrum. And I suspect that the political climate in Washington was probably this way then too, but I didn't notice it quite as much, that reluctance and resistance to working together, and a sense of wanting to advocate your position over against the other side without listening to the others. And that was really a kind of a shock as we came back in. And I think as we found that climate and environment, how it had infiltrated into the life of the church, it was also a bit of a shock. I don't think we had seen that quite as much when we left, so it's difficult.
When you talk that way, it reminds me of some of the changes that have happened in annual conference.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in the last couple of years, they've sat around tables,
Mhm.
and they've had interaction between more liberal and more conservative members of the church as a result of that
Mhm.
that configuration. Will that continue? Will that
Yes.
roundtable continue?
Yeah, I don't think the roundtables are going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's been generally a positive experience. I think at first, people were a little uncertain as to how that was going to work, but it didn't take long, I don't think, in the first year for people to feel like that was a really valuable experience, even if they were seated at tables with persons that they really seriously disagreed with. The opportunity to listen and the expectation that they would be hearing from others, I think that was a valuable experience. I didn't hear of very many experiences in which it was not positive, so I'm really thankful that we're continuing with that. One of the things that I'm hoping we'll be able to do more this year is not only to meet around round tables for business and table talk times, but to begin the conference with times of Bible study around the tables, and I'm really excited about that. The Thursday morning and Friday morning, we're going to spend a spacious hour, that's what I'm calling it, around the round tables doing Bible study, and of course based on Philippians. But I'm really hoping and praying that God's Spirit will be very strongly felt around those tables. And as people study, all of us studying the same scripture together and having questions prompt our sharing, that we'll really be able to hear one another and to listen to one another and maybe to gain some new insight that we hadn't heard before, and to appreciate the way in which God can speak to someone else, even though they are really quite different from us. I think that'll be and I think also the importance of being able to hear what it is that we sense God is saying to us as a community, and discern that together, I think is really valuable time spent.
There's a mission statement that talks about the word and action. And then there's a theme of courageous discipleship. Did you pick the theme?
I did. Yeah, I was searching for some way to bring my love for the scriptures to the theme. And I had thought for a long time about the possibility of having everyone study the same book throughout the year. During our time of sort of sabbatical time in Virginia, we were able to participate in the Virginia Mennonite Conference event, sort of their annual conference, but for their conference. And their whole weekend, that weekend, was based on the book of Philippians. And it was such a delightful experience to have each worship service focused on a different chapter, and the speakers speaking to how they heard God speaking to them through Philippians. It made quite an impression on me. So as I was searching and praying and trying to discern what would be helpful for the denomination, that whole experience and concept of studying a book together came back to me. And then I had spent some time thinking about the denominational vision statement, and one day it just all came together for me when I realized that the denominational vision statement starts with an emphasis in Scripture. It says, through Scripture, Jesus calls us to live as courageous disciples by word and action. And so you have that sense of being called forth into courageous action and discipleship, but it comes out of an understanding of Scripture and how God calls us. And as I thought about courageous disciples, it just seemed to me that the ministry and work and apostleship of Paul would be a good example and a good way to get into that concept of courageous discipleship. So Philippians really gives us that opportunity, and I hope people have studied Acts 16 and some of the stories of Acts following Paul's journeys to see the incredible things that happened to him and the way in which his following after Christ really called him to be courageous. It's really been an inspiration to me.
Nancy Sollenberger, Heishman, thank you so much for being with us on Brethren Voices. It's been delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight and just sharing your spiritual journey with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for being with us today on Brethren Voices. This is Brent Carlson.
And Nancy Sollenberger Heishman.
Wishing you peace.
Peace.